Hello dear friends, you are on Ruslan Belov's channel, and this is the daily summary of combat operations from the Ukrainian front. Well then, the second day of negotiations is already behind us. But despite all this background of negotiations and what is hanging in the air, Russian units continue to move the front line forward. And the North, Seva grouping is once again particularly pleasing in this regard. Therefore, as usual, we are starting the broadcast precisely with their sector. If yesterday we analyzed the Volchansk sector in detail, where the fighters established control over the village of Semenovka and advanced in the area of Hravska, then now the situation is developing further. You can see everything yourselves. Only, I do not fully understand how to more correctly name this sector, because formally this is no longer the Volchansk direction. Probably it would be more correct to speak of the Kyiv direction. So, until recently, this sector was considered absolutely dead, to such an extent that there had been no advances here for more than a year. And suddenly the guys managed to shift the front, and shifted it along a section more than 8 kilometers wide. Can you imagine? I will repeat it once more. Prior to this, the front here didn't just stand still for months. Effectively since May 2024, practically no noticeable changes occurred. And suddenly, an advance along a strip of more than 8 kilometers. Among the most important results, they managed to finally capture the village of Staritsa. Although, to speak more precisely, it is more correct to say that the Russian side regained control over Staritsa, because this settlement had already been taken previously. This happened in May 2024, however, then Ukrainian forces managed to recapture the village back during counterattacks. And as a result, for almost 2 years, in essence, the front line here remained motionless. And now Staritsa is under Russia's control again. Moreover, further west, they managed to advance along the highway running along the line of the Staritsa River by approximately 1 kilometer and 300 meters. What can be said here? If the armed forces of Ukraine AFU are having such serious failures even on such deaf and long immobile sectors as the Kyiv direction, then this actually speaks volumes. As for the immediate prospects, then undoubtedly it is necessary to begin work on the forest massif located in Mezhdurekie, that is, between the Staritsa River and the Toretsk Donetsk. The AFU has a number of strongholds located there, plus defensive structures. And until the Russian army knocks the Ukrainian units out of this forest, they will always be able to accumulate there, increase pressure, and regularly try to challenge Russia's control over the already occupied settlements, both from the eastern direction and from the western one. Therefore, without taking this forest massif, it is impossible to ensure a stable situation on the flanks, and if we talk about the advance south from Staritsa, then the nearest prospect is reaching the village of Izbitskoe. From the current positions to it, there remains approximately about 3 kilometers. It would seem that 3 kilometers is a small distance, but not for this sector. Once again, let's keep in mind that before the current activation, the front here actually stood still for a year and a half. So we will observe closely. However, considering that the front line has come into motion and more than 6 square kilometers were taken under control at once, it can be said with confidence. We will yet see movement toward Izbitskoe, and it is quite possible that already in February or March we will be talking about battles for this settlement. Let's move on. News is coming from Kupiansk that looks extremely unfavorable for the AFU. Many in the comments previously wrote and noted that supposedly Russian troops take Kupiansk under control with difficulty and then literally in a couple of weeks give it back to the Ukrainian side. And allegedly the same thing happens with other settlements. But this is not so. Right now, Ukrainian troops are suffering huge losses here, but at the same time, they have not been able to return Kupiansk for more than a month and a half. The front line today remains without noticeable changes. The Ukrainian side brings up reserves daily, conducts counterattacks. However, Russian FPV crews are actively working against Ukrainian units, and practically the AFU cannot advance here for now. They have been getting bogged down in this direction for a month and a half already, trying to recapture Kupiansk. Despite the fact that the Russian military previously fought for this settlement for a long time, many claimed that it was given up too easily. But in reality, Kupiansk was effectively not abandoned. Currently, Russian troops hold the northern and eastern parts of the city. And I will repeat once again, The AFU are suffering serious losses here, however they are not managing to achieve the desired result for now. In addition, some pro-Russian sources report that Russian troops were able to break through the defensive line and clear this entire territory, after which it passed under Russian control. It is reported that Russian units have come right up to Petropavlovka, and this pocket is now effectively being cleared. Let me remind you, earlier the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation had already stated that Petropavlovka had completely passed under Russia's control, but that information did not correspond to reality at that time. Perhaps the reports on the ground were indeed exaggerated and did not reflect the situation objectively. Now Petropavlovka is under the control of Russian forces, and pro-Russian sources write that Russian troops have approached the settlement closely, not only from the north but also from the east. If this information is confirmed and corresponds to reality, then an extremely difficult situation is shaping up for the AFU here. Because after taking Petropavlovka, the Russian army effectively straightens out the front line in this manner. This whole pocket is being cleared, and Russian troops continue to exert pressure on Kucherovka, on the remaining part of Kupiansk, as well as on Kupiansk-Uzlovy. Although even now the pressure is coming from several directions: Kupiansk-Uzlovy, Podoli, Kucherovka, and Petropavlovka. Nevertheless, the closing of this pocket will seriously ease the position of Russian troops, forces will be freed up, and then the clearing of the entire territory will begin. Some pro-Russian sources claim that for 2026, the Russian military has the task to completely clear this pocket and effectively reach the Oskol River. Let me remind you, the Oskol River flows here. Currently, Ukrainian units use crossings, which are gradually being destroyed by Russian crews and artillery. However, despite this, the Ukrainian side still has certain crossings, and the AFU, Armed Forces of Ukraine, holds positions in Kupiansk-Uzlovy, Podoli, Petropavlovka, and other settlements of this district. As for the Lyman sector, for now no new reports of advances have been received. From what is known, fighting is taking place directly within the city itself, in its southeastern part. It is also reported that Russian troops are gradually cutting Ukrainian logistics, and AFU positions in the settlement are becoming increasingly shaky. But on the other hand, news arrived from another direction. They managed to advance in Reznikovo, and advance quite significantly. Russian fighters passed through the residential build-up of the village for more than 1 kilometer, and Reznikovo, as you can see perfectly well on the map, is a very elongated settlement. That is, if measuring the distance from the eastern outskirt to the western, it comes out to more than 6.5 kilometers. And thanks to the current advance, already more than half of the village is under Russian control. And what is extremely important, the advance occurred not only inside the settlement itself through the residential sector, but also along the heights to the north. And the heights here are a key factor, because whoever controls the heights automatically gets the advantage and control over the sectors to the south, including the residential area of Reznikovo. That is exactly why initially the Russian army moved along the heights, and only after that did the clearing of the village itself begin. What will happen next if Russian fighters finish squeezing Reznikovo? Next will follow the exit first to the settlement of Kaliniki, and then, Ray Alexandrovka. And after taking Ray Alexandrovka, one will be able to say that Russian troops are already on the approaches to Slavyansk. In general, after the fall of Seversk, despite the extremely difficult relief of the terrain, and here there are elevation changes, hills, and inconvenient geography, the Ukrainian side still fails to stop the advance of Russian units. The fighters continue to move forward at a rather fast pace, and the advance was not only in Reznikovo. Successes are also noted to the south, more precisely, to the southeast. Here fighters advanced in the pocket between Pazino and Reznikovo, thereby pushing the line of combat engagement further away from Zvanovka. Now the task is obvious: continue moving the front to the west and completely close this pocket to secure Reznikovo from AFU counterattacks from the south, and only after that, with doubled strength, advance toward the important intermediate point, toward Ray Alexandrovka. At this moment, the trend on this sector is exclusively positive. If such a tempo is preserved, then already by the middle of summer, the Russian army may well reach Nikolaevka, and by the end of summer, Slavyansk. Of course, this is provided that an agreement on Ukraine between the USA and Russia is not reached earlier. Well, and if, as you perfectly understand, the Russian army ends up at Slavyansk, then, you must agree, that will be a completely different conversation. Now the Pokrovsk direction. Reports are coming in that Russian troops are actively advancing in the residential part of Grishino, in its southern sector. Here, the advance is going along 2 streets. The line of movement is forming in this way. Previously, video materials already appeared confirming that forward positions of Russian units were located at the indicated points. Now Russian troops are developing success precisely in the southern part of the settlement. It is also reported that the Russian side is gradually forming a pocket between Grishino and the section along the railway. Thus, Russian units continue to develop success, and now a pocket is forming on this sector, which will undoubtedly be cleared in the near future. As soon as information about the advance along the railway and about further advance directly inside Grishino itself is confirmed. The thing is that the last video material from here was received precisely from this point, and back then it was reported that in this area, Russian servicemen were taken prisoner by the AFU. After that, confirming materials from this territory did not appear anymore. However, news and reports from there arrived repeatedly. Today, information is also arriving about the advance of Russian forces on this sector of the line of combat engagement, including along the railway. Most likely, already tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, if the information is indeed confirmed, we will see confirming materials as well. Accordingly, changes will be made to the map. Messages are also coming from Rodinsko. Here, Russian troops are expanding the zone of control to the west of this settlement. Let me remind you that fortified AFU positions were located precisely in these industrial structures. It was from here that the Ukrainian side undertook counterattacks daily in the direction of Rodinsko, and previously it was not possible to knock them out of these fortified areas. According to sources, strikes were repeatedly delivered on these objects with FABs, aerial bombs, artillery worked actively, and FPV drones were also used. Now it is reported that Russian forces are expanding the zone of control west of Rodinsko and expanding it quite significantly, and it is not excluded that they were able to gain a foothold directly in these industrial buildings. At this moment, there are no confirming video materials from here yet. However, such reports are arriving. And let's move further north on the map. If we talk about the Dobropilia salient, then news is arriving here about a serious advance of Russian units in the area of the settlement of Beletsko. Yesterday we discussed information that Russian troops managed to gain a foothold and take control of 5 streets, specifically 5 eastern streets. In addition, it was reported that 6 multi-story buildings passed under Russian control. These high-rises effectively start from the central part, and some of them, according to available data, might have passed under the control of Russian forces. However, at that time, the information had no confirmation. And now news is already arriving that Russian troops have not just gained a foothold in Beletskoye, but are also continuing to successfully push through the Ukrainian defense in this area. At the same time, Russian units continue to exert pressure in the direction of the settlement of Novy Donbass. Previously, data arrived from here about the expansion of the zone of control, but as of today, there are only reports without confirming materials. The same applies to Shakovo. Shakovo is currently not fully under the control of Russian forces, despite the fact that some Russian sources write about the complete capture of this settlement. In reality, the northern part of Shakovo is currently significantly located in the grey zone, meaning it is not controlled by the Russian military. Similar reports are arriving regarding the areas of Sofievka and Toretskaya. They say that Sofievka is already fully under the control of Russian troops. Russian units are holding the settlement and attempting to develop pressure in the direction of Toretskaya. However, the situation here is complicated by the fact that the armed forces of Ukraine, AFU, have a large number of fortified areas, developed lines of fortifications, as well as a huge concentration of FPV crews on this sector. In such conditions, it is extremely difficult for Russian troops to advance, and at times it looks practically impossible. Ukrainian FPV groups are actively working against Russian positions and their assault units. Therefore, it can be assumed that Russian forces are suffering serious losses here, but at the same time, no noticeable advances are being recorded yet. As soon as additional confirmed information appears, changes will be made to the map. And next, we move on to Konstantinovka. News is arriving from here that Russian troops are significantly expanding the zone of control in the eastern part of this district. Video materials have already appeared from this point previously. This entire territory, according to them, passed under the control of Russian forces. In addition, another video material arrived from a different point. It was reported there about an advance of Russian units by approximately 1 kilometer. Today, news is coming that the zone of control here has become even wider in favor of the Russian army. It is also reported that Russian troops are expanding control in the eastern part of the territory, specifically north of the supply road. This road runs like this, and in this direction, Russian units are currently increasing their zone of presence. Perhaps in the coming days, we will see map updates in favor of the Russian army as soon as confirming materials appear. As of today, there are only reports of such a nature. Summing up the overall result for the past 24 hours, 1 settlement and 12.5 square kilometers of territory passed under Russian control. No advances were recorded on the part of the AFU. That is all I have on the general situation on the front. However, there is important information coming from Kupiansk. A very difficult situation is taking shape here, and not for the Russian army, but specifically for Ukrainian units inside Kupiansk itself. As you know, peace negotiations took place between Kyiv and Moscow, however they ended without a concrete result. No substantial progress occurred. The Russian side states that Ukrainian troops must withdraw their forces from the Donbass, that is, from the Luhansk region and from the Donetsk region. At the same time, Moscow, by all appearances, is ready to make certain concessions to Kyiv and conclude a peace agreement, the very one that was discussed with Trump in Alaska. And what exactly does it imply? Let's sort it out. Ukrainian troops withdraw forces from the Donbass, that is, from the Luhansk and Donetsk regions, after which the line of combat engagement is fixed and the whole situation is frozen along the current front line. Part of the Zaporozhye region remains under the control of the Ukrainian side, part of the Zaporozhye region under the control of the Russian side. A similar scheme is envisioned for the Kherson region as well. We see that the Russian side is indeed demonstrating a readiness for concessions. However, how reliable this information is remains unknown for now. It is quite possible that these are negotiations for the sake of negotiations, without a real intention to reach a final decision. The Ukrainian side, in turn, reports that such an option is unacceptable. The surrender of Donbass territories is impossible for Ukraine. Consequently, Ukrainian troops will not be withdrawn from the Donbass. Against the backdrop of tense events, a public statement by a Ukrainian politician caused additional resonance. The secretary of the Verkhovna Rada Committee on National Security, Defense and Intelligence, Roman Kostenko, published a statement of the following content in his Telegram channel. Either die or destroy Russia, we have no other choice. Based on this, one can assume that the Ukrainian side indeed does not intend to withdraw troops from the Donbass, which means combat operations will continue. And what does the American side say? The USA states that the negotiations took place in a positive atmosphere, and the parties have become one step closer to a peaceful conclusion of the conflict. However, at the same time, no concrete decisions have been made yet. The negotiation process continues, just as before, just like last time and the time before that. Only the delegations change. My opinion regarding the conclusion of the conflict, if it indeed happens, and if peace is really concluded, comes down to two possible scenarios of how events will develop. The first option, Russian troops hold the Luhansk and Donetsk regions under control, and combat operations are frozen along the current line of contact. Part of the Zaporozhye and Kherson regions remains under the control of Russian forces, part under the control of the Ukrainian side. At the same time, Russian troops withdraw from the Sumy and Kharkiv regions, fully transferring control over the Sumy and Kharkiv regions to Kyiv. And the second option, the Ukrainian side refuses peace negotiations, the Russian army continues pressure, takes the rest of the Donetsk region, takes the rest of the Luhansk region. Then the main forces switch to the Zaporozhye direction, pressure begins on the Zaporozhye region, and then the question arises of forcing the Dnieper and fully taking the Kherson region. After that, according to the logic of such a scenario, a buffer zone is formed around these four regions. And further, Russia will have to outline conditions to Kyiv. If Ukraine does not stop shelling Russian territories, and these territories will already be under Russian control, there will be no Ukrainian troops there, then Russia will, in essence, view such actions as a continuation of the war, and may declare that in such a case, Russian forces will go further, already in the direction of Kyiv.